Part B, Basic Properties of JavaBeans. 3.1, Using JavaBeans in JSP. All right. After we learn the basic concept of JavaBeans, so this time we need to use it. Typically, we use it inside JSP. So we want to add data processing power to JSP. All right, so let's look at how do we do it. Create a JavaBean in JSP. To do that, we need a JSP use bean tag. So we learned before, this is called JSP action, right? So we, this special JSP element, we call it JSP action. All the JSP actions are in the tag format. So here we use the tag, JSP use bean tag. Right. So now, when we use that, we can create a JavaBean in a JSP. So what's that? A JavaBean in a JSP is any instantiated object. So that's the meaning of this. JavaBean in a JSP. The meaning is any instantiated Java object. So here I need to explain the meaning carefully here. So look at how we write this object. Java space bean. Look at the space. There is a space between Java bean. So it is different from Java no space bean. No space bean. These two concepts are different. Okay? Yeah. All right. So why different? Yeah, let me explain a little bit. Because this Java space bean, it does not need to follow JavaBeans specification. Okay? It's a different concept. So here, it is very confusing. Yeah. So here I want to separate it. Because this Java space bean is very easy to get confused with JavaBean. Java no space bean. Yeah. So it's better when we call this, it's better we call JSP bean because we use it in a JSP. Yeah. So if we call it a JSP bean, then we won't get confused with that JavaBean concept. But what's that? Because inside JSP, so many times we need to use Java object. But we need to use general Java object to do data processing. When we do that, sometimes we do not require our Java object the same as a JavaBean. Not necessary, right? Sometimes we need a JavaBean, sometimes we do not need a JavaBean, right? Yeah. So with that flexibility, so we can use non-JavaBean JSP bean. It's okay. But some of the rules in JavaBean specification, we do not have to follow. Right? If we can do the job. Yeah. So that's the point. Yeah. But one thing keep in mind, if you do not follow any rule of JavaBean specification, you may have the consequence. Some of the features you may not have. If you miss some of the rules specified in JavaBean specification, you may lose features associated with those rules. So I will talk about that later, related to data binding. So if you do not follow the naming rules, then you will lose the data binding feature. All right, here I spent quite some time to separate these two concepts. Okay, these concepts. All right, syntax, how do we instantiate a Java object? We use this way. Do instantiation. Java :UseBean tag ID. When you do instantiation, you need to use a reference name. So ID attribute gives the reference name of this JSP bean. Class. Which class do we use to construct this object? So we specify the full name, full path class name. And we also specify the scope. There is a default scope, so we'll talk about that. Yeah, but usually we need to specify a particular scope here. Yeah. Then, in this way, it instantiates a class. Yeah. So this class, Java class, not necessarily a Java bean class, not necessary. All right? Yeah. This bean, JSP bean, yeah. So when we say this bean, so you see the name this bean, yeah, it means JSP bean. Okay. General, more general than a Java bean. Okay. Can then be accessed in these three ways. First one, EL way. So what's that? EL way. Express language. No, sorry, expression. Might be something not quite right. Yeah, expression language. Expression language. This is a very important technology, or we can say sub-technology inside JSP. It is used inside JSP. Expression language. We want to express some specific structure in JSP in a simple way. So we use this expression language. So what's that? Because this is an important, big topic. So we will use next module, we will use one whole module we want to talk about this important sub-technology inside JSP. All right. Yeah, so we delay it. But in this part, we will use a little bit this expression language, EL expression, but I just give you simple expression and explain in a simple way. In our next module, module 5, we will learn all the details of this sub-technology. Second type, scripts. In scripts, then we can use JSPbeans to create it. Another place, JSP expressions, we can also use JSPbeans to do some data processing. We like to, So in this way, you can see, in this way, we introduce some data processing Java object, so we can add business processing power in our JSP. So remember, in our JSP, we do not want to directly do the business processing, data processing, because that's not good. So we try to minimize the Java code inside JSP. because the main purpose using JSP to present data presentation. All right. Then preparation for set bean properties. Before you can set bean properties, we may need to change data inside our JSP, but we need to do some preparation. Let's look at this simple example. So first, we need to create a bean, JSP bean. ID, class, one line, okay? One tag, one element. To do this, there is an equivalent expression for it. So if we use the JSP scriptlet, here it is equivalent to do things like this. Okay? So you use the class. Which class do you use? The reference. You have the reference. Then you call the constructor. Okay? Then you create that object, the bean object. Then you store. Here we do not specify the scope. We use the default scope. Now, we will see that default scope. So you store this bean in default scope. But here I want to point something a little subtle here, because there are two cases. So although we say equivalent, but for one of the two cases it is equivalent. Two cases. The first case, this bean, so this bean already exists. First case. Second, does not exist. Does not exist. All right. So for the second case, it is equivalent. So when this bean does not exist in the current scope, default scope, does not exist, then we do this. If it exists for the first case, we do not do this. Okay? Do not do this. Okay? If it exists for the first case, you just take it. You just grab that object in the scope. Yeah. So already there, retrieve it. Retrieve it from the scope. Yeah. And then you can use it. So that kind of thing we will describe later, another time. Yeah. So that's why here I want to separate. So although we say equivalent, but in one of the two cases it is equivalent. All right. Additional option, scope, specify scope. There are 4 scopes in JSP: page, request, session, application. But the default, underline, the page is the default. If we do not specify any scope, we use the page scope. Okay? Yeah. All right, so now we have that. So we have a being created store in one of the 4 scopes. So then, yeah, because which of the 4 scopes we should use, that depends on how do you plan to use this being object. Okay? Sometimes you may need to use this being object across multiple pages. Okay? So associated with more than just the one page. Then you cannot use page scope. Page scope you can only use in the current page. When you move to the second page, it's gone. Okay? Yeah. So sometimes you need to use the request scope. Okay. So you store the bean if it's in request scope, then the current page using the forward. Remember, using forward, not redirect. So we spend a lot of time understanding redirect and the forward. So if you use the forward way to the next page, you can still access the bean in the request scope. But if you use the session scope, then many pages, you can access that in many different pages because the session takes, so there is a period of time for the session. The default duration of a session object, 30 minutes, default. Okay? So if you do not set that time, default 30 minutes. Quite long, so you can do a lot of things in a session. But remember, when you use session object, it consumes significant, quite some memory storage space. So only when you really need to use that, then you use that. Otherwise, try to avoid using that session. In this module, the later part, we will talk about session management. All right. Obtain a reference to the existing. Now, we look at that two cases we discussed already. Two cases. The first case, if no existing, create one. Yeah, that's the time we have. We run this line. Yeah. No existing bean, so create one. Yeah. If there is existing, return it. Return it from the current scope, return it. Yeah. So that's the, do not create a new one. Yeah. You have an existing one, so you should reuse it. Reuse it. And the existing one may carry some data you need. If you create a new one, you can not get the data in the existing thing, right? So it's not good. So you use the existing thing. All right, next. Load a bean in a JSP and set its properties. Now, after we create a bean, we need to use it. When you use it, you need to access and change its data inside the bean. So we look at that. Set properties. We use this tag, JSP set property tag. Look at this example. First, we just declare get a bean from the scope. Remember, two cases, existing bean or create a new one. Okay? Yeah, but at the end, we have a bean available for us to use. Okay? So not necessarily newly created. It could be an existing bean. After that, then we use the second line, set property. JSP set property. This time, name attribute. So you point to the same reference we used here. Okay? They should match. Because we want to use that thing. Okay? Yeah. Then, how to set a value? Property. Which property you want to set a new value? Property name property. What value you want to set? So value, you specify your value. So in this simple way, you set that one property. This way. All right. So when you set a property internally, inside a container, JSP container, appropriate setter is called. Specifically for this property, the setter set name. method is called. Okay? Yeah. So you need to make sure your bean must have this method. Otherwise, it breaks. Okay? So for this particular place, you need to follow the naming rule. JavaBeans naming rule that this particular, because you need to use this property, you need to use this feature, right? So you have to follow this naming rule in your JSPbeans. Okay? Yeah. All right. So then the container calls it automatically. So you do not see it, yeah, but it happens behind the scene. So that's the setter part. Next, let's look at the getter part. Getter bean properties. Very similar way as the setter way. JSP::get property tag. So in the example, first line the same as before. Yeah? So we just get that bean first. Right. After that, you want to retrieve the value. So you want to get a value from the bean and you display it in this JSP, this current location. You want to display that value. Okay? Yeah. So use this way. JSP::get property, name same as the bean reference, ID value, property, which property you want to get, this property name. Then it will return the value of the property. Okay? Yeah. The value. Yeah. Because that value, we can use another way, JSP expression way. So that is equivalent to, so this way equivalent to this one. When you use this property, make sure you need to follow the JavaBeans naming rule with respect to this property. Get property naming rule. You need to follow that. Okay? If you do not use this feature, then you do not have to follow that rule. But if you really need to use this feature, then in this particular place, you need to follow the naming rule. Yeah. So that's the thing I pointed out in our first slide. In the first slide, I said you may not have to follow all the JavaBeans specification rules. But if you do not follow some of the rules, you will not use the corresponding features for those rules. Okay? We need to be aware of it. Okay? So here we use set property method, get property method. We explain those two features. If you need to use any of them, you need to make sure you follow the corresponding naming rule. All right. Another way we can display the same data in an EL way. Although here we haven't learned the EL, the whole theory, but here just to point out, EL is that fast, simple, easy way to display your data. The format is very simple. Dollar, a pair of curly braces, then your object reference, you need to have some Java object, okay, stored in certain scope, any of the 4 scopes. So stored somewhere there, then you refer to it, person dot. Then you can get its property, name property, dot, name. So you retrieve the value of that property. So that's the EL. All right. There are a lot of properties, a lot of rules related to EL. So we will spend, a few classes to learn EL. All right. It retrieves properties using getter. Yeah. So here you need to make sure, because the container will call it automatically. So, but you need to do the preparation for the container. Okay? Otherwise, the container will complain. Otherwise, you will see the error message. Get main method is missing, not available. Okay? So runtime error. Okay? Runtime error. Because at the compile time, you cannot find it, right? Yeah. Compile time. So how do you find it? Right. But at the runtime, the container really need to call it, do it, Yeah, I'm not sure. At the compile time, the container can detect it. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so I need to do some testing, and try to see if if at a compile, So here the problem is this. Remember, the problem is this. This JavaBean, not JavaBean, this JSP, if it is not called, if we do not request it, it won't be compiled. So how do we know the error message is compile time or runtime, right? So, but we definitely will see the error message. Definitely we will see the error message when you access this page. If you don't provide appropriate getter for this property. All right. So container automatically. But here, one important thing happened. Data binding happened. Because what's the data binding? So look at this slide and the previous slide called setter getter automatically. So that's the meaning of data binding. So when we do data binding, the container will call setter getter automatically to copy data between what? Between HTML form fields. And JSPbeans properties. Automatically. All right. In the next part, I will talk about that data binding. Very simple. After we have seen setters, how setters, getters work inside JSP, then we're almost there. So we are halfway there to the data binding concept. We will see that in the 3.2. All right, so let's finish this part.